Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. Things that we've talked a lot about are just our themes from the Lord of the Rings books and other books in Middle Earth, and compare them to themes in the Rings of Power show. And in most of those instances, those themes are, in a big way, like from a Christian worldview. But I think then what we want to do is go a little deeper than that and think about how Tolkien's Christian worldview influenced his writings and how he wrote that into his stories. Is there anything you guys have that sticks out in a big way about just the worldview in general?
Generally, the first one that pops to mind is whenever you think of the Lord of the Rings story specifically, there's usually three Christ types in the story. I think it's important to note that when we talk about this, Tolkien didn't write like a one-to-one story, right? It's not like the Narnia is the easiest example, right? Like there's no single character that's supposed to be Jesus, like Aslan is in that story.
Tolkien famously did not like allegory, and he did not like it when people said Lord of the Rings was an allegory, and he didn't like Narnia specifically because it was an allegory.
Yeah. And especially I think some people are like, oh, is Sauron supposed to be Hitler, because it's maybe around World War II. It's like, no, that's not what Tolkien was trying to do. But there are these three Christ types that may be intentionally or unintentionally, but that you're generally considered to be Gandalf, because he returns and he's the resurrected savior. It's Aragorn because he's the returning king, especially a king who's built up and anticipated for a very long time by his people, and by returning he saves them. And then actually, I've mentioned this before, but the sort of surprise one is Gollum as the sacrificial lamb. Because this is made very clear that Gollum is provided, right? There's a scene in Moria whenever Gandalf and Frodo are talking that hey, Gollum was meant to survive, Bilbo saved him, and Gollum was meant to be here. And therefore, there's this very clear picture that at the end of the story, Gollum, when he claims the ring, falls off. And this is because Frodo wanted to claim the ring for himself. And this is the idea that nobody could have destroyed the ring without, the only way that anybody would have ever, dropped the ring in is by accident. And the only person who maybe could have dropped it in by accident was Gollum, who had yearned for it so long that after he gets it, he just sort of freaks out, rather than maybe somebody else, being more covert about it. So this is intentional. Gollum was provided as the sacrificial lamb to destroy the ring, that nobody else could. And so those are generally the three Christ types that I think of whenever I read Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, I honestly, I know we talked about Christian themes and other inspirations. I would like to focus a little bit, if that's okay, on some of the other inspirations and sort of ideas of it, because like I said in the last episode, it was written in the tradition of epic poetry. So I don't know if y'all are familiar, but it was sort of his goal in setting out with not just the Lord of the Rings, with the whole legendarium in general, was to be a mythology for England. And so I think he pulls in Christianity because surprisingly other mythologies, because they've been written down by Christian monks, sort of had Christianizing elements added into them. But he pulls in, he's writing it more almost from a pagan-ish sort of tradition. Now, obviously, he's very clearly writing it from a Catholic position and a Christian perspective, with the things you said with the Christ-like characters, and I think the most obvious one is Eru being the one true God. That's pretty on the nose.
Yeah. Who's also like omnipotent and like
Yeah.
guiding everything, right? So
Yeah.
not just like a really powerful dude, but like an all powerful dude.
Yeah. And then you have, especially not Sauron as Satan, but Melkor is a pretty obvious Satan archetype because he was the greatest of the definitely not angels trademarked guy, who then falls pretty much explicitly because he wants to surpass Eru. But it is also very much in a mythological sort of framework, and in the tradition of the Eddas and things like that. We talked a little bit off camera about how a lot of the dwarven names are ripped straight from this list in the Poetic Edda. So you have things like Thorin and even Gandalf were elves in Norse or dwarves in Norse mythology. That Tolkien was just like, those sound like great names for dwarves. I'm going to write about them going and killing the dragon. And so, yeah, I think that it's very fascinating to look at all the different inspirations that he is writing from.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting. This is something I read back when I read a biography of Tolkien, but that when Tolkien wrote, he was trying to make this like mythology, but there's also this sense that, like, Tolkien thinks that stories should be like true in a sense that, like,
Yeah.
hey, if Tolkien would feel like, hey, if I were to write a story where all the characters were morally gray or something, that wouldn't be true to life, because in life there really is evil and good, and really is a god behind everything, who is controlling everything. So in the sense that there's like Tolkien isolates these themes and ideas from life that like are so fundamental or true that any story without them would be in some ways flawed, and puts them into his story, and then changes everything else that he thinks is like sort of the non-essential facts of our reality, such as its history and stuff like that. Yeah, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, Tolkien as philologist, I think, comes through a lot in his work as like the names specifically of the elves and dwarves and all of those.
That, and also alongside it being written as a mythology for England, there is also an argument to be made that he did, well, it's not even an argument to be made, it's just true that he did not create his languages for his story. He created his languages and then was like, I wonder what the story of how these languages came about and the people that spoke them was, and then he wrote the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings. So, like, yeah, he was not an author first and foremost, he was a linguist first and foremost, which is why Sindarin and Quenya are still, like, the first and foremost held up conlangs of all time because they were the best.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I read this that like Tolkien was grading a paper and it was on some old poem, and I read the poem one time, I forget what it is, but in the poem it's like Arendelle the mariner sails the stars or something. And this was like the very first idea he had for any Lord of the Rings related idea. The Arendelle the mariner is of course Elrond's father, and becomes a star and stuff. But it's really interesting as well that like whenever we think of Tolkien, we think of, hobbits and stuff like that. But really the Silmarillion is sort of his first brainchild.
Oh, yeah.
And the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings are more stories that are based off of his own like original fantasy world. But yeah.
It's funny too. I was just gonna say that when he wrote The Hobbit, he did not initially conceive it as part of the same world as the Silmarillion. It was only later that he connected them through writing The Lord of the Rings. And I cannot remember which YouTuber it was. It was probably Lord of the Rings or something along those lines that was talking about when in the discussion of is the Arkenstone a Silmaril, he's like, no, it's not a Silmaril. But it also is a Silmaril because it fills the same place in the story as the Silmarils did in the Silmarillion, because he didn't conceive of this as part of that world yet. And so he basically was lifting ideas from the Silmarillion and putting them in The Hobbit. And so, yeah, the Arkenstone is not it's not a Silmaril, but it is a Silmaril. And so it's not until later that he connects them. This side tangent.
Yeah, I think I read that it was during when he was writing Lord of the Rings, actually, that he connected them. That he starts out writing a sequel to The Hobbit, and it starts out like very much like The Hobbit did, where somebody's going on an adventure. But what was really interesting is that it was whenever he was writing the Black Riders, and they seemed very dark, right? Like, and this is not like
Yeah.
The Hobbit. The Hobbit is very lighthearted. And it was while writing the Black Riders, I was like, oh, this is like the evil Lord's ring, and these are his servants, and
Yeah.
this is like what connected those two worlds of
Okay,
his.
yeah.
That made it a very much darker and more mature storyline than The Hobbit was. So, like, yeah, The Hobbit actually, like, in general, is just not connected to the same universe. At
Yeah.
least not at the time of its conception. You know, he did a little editing later on
Yeah.
that of the world itself. But yeah,
There's a great meme about The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. It's like, the Hobbit to Lord of the Rings pipeline is insane when you think about it. It would be like if E.B. White, 35 years after he'd written Stuart Little, wrote a book about how Stuart Little's nephew went and killed Satan.
yeah, right.
It's like the different, like, it's a children's book and then it's an epic fantasy novel that's the sequel, and yet they're both really good and really fit together.
I think what's really interesting too is that like the Hobbit also has like a lot of these like themes and ideas. Like for example, the Bjornings, like that doesn't really fit anywhere in like Tolkien's like mythology, right? They're just sort of like these men who can magically transform into bears and
Yeah.
stuff.
Well,
And there's also these
hobbits.
ideas.
Hobbits don't fit into his older mythology. They're like an offshoot of men is the best explanation we get for them. But like, yeah, it's this real interesting connection where there's almost more things in the Lord of the Rings than in the Silmarillion, which I think makes the world seem way more exotic and interesting. Because if you think about it, it's like, okay, in the Silmarillion, you read about elves and dwarves and orcs and stuff. And then in the Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, you read about Bjornings and hobbits and ents and things like that. What else is hiding in this world?
Right, like there's some really some sort of like the official history or something, and
Yeah.
like the actual events, and we're like, oh wow, there's like so much more of this world than we ever thought was possible,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Sort of this idea, yeah. It's always really cool, but yeah, it's interesting that like that he didn't tie these two stories together and sort of had envisioned them originally as two separate things.
And it's impressive that he could tie them together. Because I haven't written many books, but I have come up with multiple, like, universes in my head because I had an overactive and still have an overactive imagination. But, and, like, you try to connect them in your head because it's just like, I like connecting stories, and it's really hard. It's really hard to get these diverse themed stories to fit together in a convincing way, and yet somehow he does it, which is almost more impressive than the fact that he just wrote these stories independently. Like it'd be one thing if he'd written this one unified tale over time. It's another thing that he wrote these two completely differentiated stories and then figured out a way to tie them all together in a way where it seemed like it was planned from the beginning.
Yeah, I think though it's always the best explanation of why people don't like the Silmarillion, right? They're like, "Oh, I love Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but I didn't like." It's just a very different kind of book, right?
It's a
not
history
storybook.
book.
Yep.
Which I love because I have a history degree, but I can understand why other people wouldn't want to read
Hey,
it.
the Silmarillion is still my favorite book by Tolkien. So
Yeah, probably.
So something I know we've touched on before, but we didn't talk on this yet, is like the different things in his life that influenced, like things that came out in the books. Things like his marriage to Edith, his experience in World War One, which like varies on opinions on how much that actually really was written into the books. But any comments on any of that stuff? You guys?
I'm going
have
to
anything
make
else?
one very specific connection from his life to the books that I have read about in various places and I find pretty convincing, is that Treebeard is based on Lewis. Just kind of being this, like, very thoughtful, very pensive, kind of wise old figure that's a little bit goofy. And yeah, Treebeard is C.S. Lewis.
okay, I have to go off of that because if you guys have ever read the Space Trilogy by C.S. Lewis,
Yes.
the
I
main
know
character
that
is a philologist, just like Tolkien,
Just like
and
Tolkien.
Tolkien writes the introduction, and he's like, "Yeah, this character isn't supposed to be me," and you're like, "This is totally supposed to be you, bro." Like,
no. So,
please.
fun fact about that. This is total tangent, but Lewis and Tolkien made a bet where Lewis is supposed to write a space travel story, and Tolkien is supposed to write a time travel story, and very characteristically of each of them, Lewis wrote 3 books, and Tolkien did not even finish his first one. He like wrote part of the story and never finished it. And it is also tied to the like it was a guy from Numenor that like time traveled.
Okay, I have to like go on this tangent really quick. Sorry, but this is really interesting because like if you look at Tolkien's life, like he overly obsessed about perfecting his works before ever publishing them.
Oh yeah, which is
I think it's really interesting.
4 books by him.
Right? Like there's so few books by him. But I will say that like it's really interesting and like contrasting that with like, okay, there's just been so many sequels lately, like in our popular media. And the whole incentive behind it is like, right, like, hey, it's popular, it will sell make money, we get a sequel out there, right? And so like I don't like want to be like too critical, but like a lot of these writers like writing okay stories, but they're nothing like fancy or like they don't really like have the same investment of like this guy who's like, you know, like if Tolkien had written like a sequel to Lord of the Rings late in life, like it would have been hugely successful, right? Like already his books were making money, and he did try, but then like he was like, oh, this isn't working, like right, like I'm not going to complete this, right? Like it just like the willingness to like, hey, I don't really this story is not going to be good, or I don't really want to tell this story is like something that just seems totally lacking in our popular like movies and shows.
Well, if I can go off this tangent, it wasn't even that he didn't think the story was working. He thought it was too dark. Mm-hmm. Which nowadays, like, oh, an ultra dark sequel to the Lord of the Rings, like everybody would have loved that. But he had the foresight to be like, no, this is too dark. I don't want to tell the story because it's like it's set after Aragorn's death or something, and it's like all of these kids are like playing orc, and there's cults of Sauron, and it's just like he got too depressed looking at how quickly things fell apart. He tried to write a sequel, and then after, I think it was 40 pages, he was just like, nope, I'm not doing this. This is not good.
Yeah. Really quick to jump back to the like things from Tolkien's real life. I think it's really important to say that like, clearly like nobody can create anything without like being influenced from their life. But Tolkien like also he did like I said, we didn't write analogies and stuff, and he never wanted people to like look at his life and be like, like this character did this thing. And there was like recently like a Tolkien movie, and it was like, oh, you know, like he wrote like the smog from his like World War I experience and stuff. I believe he spent most of World War I in like a sick bay because he like got really sick whenever he went to the front. Yeah. But like it just like, yeah, it's not directly taken from his life, though. I do think like his experience of like Frodo's like coming back and still like carrying the wounds is maybe not even his experience, but other friends' experience from World War I as well. And that's important to remember that like he didn't grow up isolated, right? Like he was taking a sense of the time as well.
Not analogies, but pulling them for descriptions, which sounds a lot like analogies, but it's not. Like, it's not allegorical of like, you can't say, like a lot of people have said like, oh, the orcs in Isengard is like an allegory for like the mechanization of war in World War I. It's like, okay, maybe, probably not, but he does use his experiences in the war to write a very accurate portrayal of Frodo and Sam basically struggling with PTSD as they're getting up to the mountain. I will say, the one place where it's pretty hard to argue that he wasn't writing a direct allegory is Beren and Luthien, considering he put those names on his and his wife's gravestone. So I think that one's a pretty clear, like, that was pretty clearly him basically writing himself and his wife into the story, which I think is hilarious because, again, Beren basically is just there along for the ride, and so I think it's really cool that he basically wrote his wife as the ultimate super-powered elf girl.
Yeah, I guess like I'd still say there's something like if me and my wife like write like Romeo and Juliet on our tombstones, like we didn't write that story, but we were like captured by it, and I feel like, and maybe in some sense that's maybe closer. Yeah, that'd be really cheesy and dumb. But I was just saying that like
we killed each other, yeah. Sorry, I hate that place so much.
Yeah, it's pretty dumb. But like, yeah, I think there's these like stories. Like, what is the role of a story, right? And like, it's not like necessarily even analogy. It's like capturing the essence of something,
Yeah.
right? And maybe that's maybe
It's
more of
alchemy.
like, right? But like that, like he and his wife identified with Beren and Luthien, not that they were just direct analogies to their like
Yeah.
personalities or characters.
Yeah.
And if you look at like Luthien or like, oh, this must be exactly what his wife Edith was like, you're probably not going. That's not
Yeah,
what he was
no,
trying
that's
to do,
true.
right? So
But I think, yeah, I do think that that story in particular was
deeply
more,
influenced.
yeah,
Yes.
more so than most deeply influenced, especially with the, she converted to Catholicism for him.
Mm-hmm.
Luthien gives up her fate as an elf to be with Beren. Um, it's they're one of the few people in the Silmarillion that get a happy ending.
Yeah.
So I think that yeah, it is maybe not a author insert, but closer than anything else.
Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, Keeping the Rings of Power Pure.